Good afternoon. Welcome to HCRI's first research seminar back after the Easter break. It's on human shields and the struggle for self-determination in Gaza, and we're joined by Professor Neve Gordon. But before I introduce Professor Gordon, I want to say a big thank you to Jessica Murphy and Sophie Robera, who organised our research seminar series. This is not an easy time to bring people together, particularly because most of us are a bit zoomed out with teaching and meetings, but the numbers are consistently turn up to our seminars are a credit to their hard work and how much interest there is amongst our students, colleagues, and wider network for these events. So thank you to Jessica and Sophie. And thank you to the audience for attending our events. I'm delighted to welcome here today Professor Neve Gordon. He is Professor of International Law and Human Rights at Queen Mary, University of London, and writes on issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and human rights. Neve used to teach at Ben Gurion University of the Negev, which is where I first met him back, I think, in 2014. I'm a big fan of his work, and so I'm really pleased that he agreed to speak about his new book with us here today. Professor Gordon's first book was called Israel's Occupation, and that was published in 2008 by University of California Press. It provided a structural history of Israel's mechanisms of control in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It was the first history of the occupation and serves as a reference book until this day, and indeed was very influential in the development of my own ideas. His second book was called The Human Right to Dominate, and this was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press. And this was co-written by Dr. Nicola Perugini, who's at Edinburgh University. Now, that book examines how human rights, which are generally conceived of as tools for advancing emancipation, can also be used to advance subjugation and dispossession. Neve has also edited two further volumes, one on torture with Rushama Martin, and the other on marginalised perspectives on human rights. He's written dozens of academic articles and book chapters on Israel-Palestine, human rights, the laws of war, and on thinkers such as Foucault, Arendt, Buber, and Levinas. I also want to say that during the first Intifada, Neve served as director of the Israeli NGO Physician for Human Rights. So he actively campaigns for what he believes in. Most recently, and the reason we are here today, Gordon and Perugini co-authored a second book, which is the first ever book on human shielding. Called Human Shield, A History of People in the Line of Fire, it was published last year by University of California Press, and it follows the marginal and controversial figure of the human shield over a period of 150 years. This is in order to interrogate the laws of war and how the ethics of humane violence is produced. It really is an excellent history of human shields from the American Civil War through colonial period into the global war on terror. I'm also very pleased to announce that this book has been shortlisted for the Susan Strange Book Award by the British International Studies Association, the results of which I think are announced in July. Now, the format of the event is that Neve will speak for around 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll have plenty of time for questions. Now, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and then I will gather them and present them to Professor Gordon. Thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. Over to you, Neve.
Okay, thank you. Let me just try to share. Do you see this? Okay, great. So thanks so much to the Humanitarian Conflicts Response Institute and to Mandy Turner and Jessica Murphy for organizing this event. I've never spoken at Manchester, and it is a great pleasure to do so for the first time, even though I would have wished to actually be there physically and not only through Zoom. Today's talk concentrates on human shields in Gaza, even though our book is much, much wider in scope. Nicola and I discuss colonial wars, environmental struggles, humanitarian wars, the war on terror, civil protests, and even computer games. We underscore how human shields have acquired different meanings and have been deployed in different ways over time, and claim that during each period they help illuminate the political and legal order informing social relations. For those who have not had a chance to look at it, the book tries to appeal to a broad audience. We begin each chapter with a vignette of human shielding, refrain from using unnecessary jargon, and we limited the length of each chapter to 3,500 words. Our goal was to write short chapters that would read almost like magazine articles. Before turning to Gaza and what we have learned by looking at it through the lens of human shields, I would like to say a few words about human shields more generally. The laws of war define human shields in the following way, and this is legal speak, so bear with me. The presence or movement of the civilian population or individual civilians shall not be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operations, in particular in attempts to shield military objectives from attacks or to shield, favor, or impede military operations. Many things can be said about this definition, but I will limit myself to one crucial issue. First, we see how the law operates through an avowal and disavowal of the protected status of the people who become human shields. It avows their protected status by rendering it illegal to use civilians or prisoners of war as human shields. But it also disavows their protected status by asserting that human shields will not render an area immune from attack, meaning that an area protected by human shields can still be attacked. The legal paradox of human shields at the center of our book is precisely this. While outlawing the use of human shields, the law allows, in certain circumstances, to kill them. A second legal issue that is vital for understanding Gaza has to do with the way the laws of war imagine civilians. The principle of distinction, which is arguably the bedrock of this body of law, calls on warring parties to distinguish between civilians and combatants, while offering civilians a set of protections that it does not offer combatants. These two central figures, as Helen Kinsella stresses in her book, The Image Before the Weapon, are gendered. The law of war imagined the combatant as active and the civilian as passive, an innocent bystander in need of protection. Consequently, civilian activity is most often associated with some form of participation in hostilities, which leads to the loss of protections offered by the law. As we will see, the notion of civilians as passive is crucial for understanding Gaza. Finally, I would like to make one more observation about human shields in general before zooming in on the Gaza Strip. In our book, we discuss three main types of human shields: voluntary, involuntary, and proximate, and claim that the distinction between them has to do, on the one hand, with the location of agency, and on the other hand, with the shield's relation to violence. By the way, this is an image from the 1936 Arab revolt in Palestine, where the British mandatory forces are holding two Palestinians as human shields in front of a train so that it won't be attacked by Palestinian resistance fighters. So back to our discussion. So voluntary shields are people who visibly assert their own agency. The most well-known example, which I will be returning to, is Rachel Corrie. while involuntary shields are those who ostensibly lack agency and are coerced by an active warring party to advance its goals. And I assume many of you remember the case of the citizen in Kashmir that was tied to the jeep, and like in the image of the shirt here, that was later sold to the Indian public, lauding the use of involuntary human shields. So involuntary shields are those who ostensibly lack agency and are coerced by an active warring party to advance its goals. Agency is, in other words, is located within the voluntary shield, while it acts upon the involuntary shield. Just as importantly, voluntary shields use their body in a non-violent way in an attempt to prevent or stop violence, while involuntary shields are part and parcel of the existing economy of violence. The third kind of shield, the proximate shield, refers to civilians who are trapped in the midst of fighting, and ostensibly their proximity serves to shield combatants. This is not really precise, since as we show in the book, not every civilian trapped near fighting is cast as a shield. So, for instance, Israeli citizens in Tel Aviv are not classified as proximate shields when Hamas launches rockets towards the Israel Defense Force military command headquarters located in the city center. By sharp contrast, Palestinian civilians are cast as proximate shields when Israel bombs Hamas command centers and military infrastructures in Gaza. Crucially, in the case of proximate shields, agency is absent. This is very significant because due to the absence of agency, proximate shields introduce numerical, spatial, and temporal dimension that do not exist with respect to the two other types of shielding, and consequently render this kind of shielding more conducive to the application of lethal violence in contemporary armed conflict, in particular the predominantly urban context of the war on terror. Numerically, entire urban population can be framed as proximate shields because the shield is produced through a performative speech act rather than the agency of either the belligerents or civilians who are on the ground. Through the utterance of ongoing citation of the phrase human shields in press releases, literally hundreds of thousands of people across the Middle East, Asia, Africa have been framed as proximate shields. So you can see here, ISIS holds 100,000 human shields in Mosul is an utterance, a press release put out by the United Nations that in 1 minute transformed 100,000 civilians into human shields. Spatially, the portrayal of whole civilian population as proximate shields allows the attacking forces to frame huge urban spaces as target, since by definition, human shields protect legitimate military targets. So if voluntary and involuntary shields occupy a specific space between a belligerent and its target, proximate shields can be anywhere and are often everywhere in a particular urban space. Temporally, proximate shielding can endure far longer than either voluntary or involuntary shielding because the latter two are restricted to time during which the civilian acts or is forced into acting as a shield. By contrast, since proximate shields become shields through performative iteration, namely the incessant accusation Hamas is deploying human shields, circulated by the IDF, literally thousands of civilians can be characterized as shields for days, weeks, and at times months on end. Proximate shields can exist as long as urban areas are attacked and the fighting persists. Crucially, the numerical, spatial, and temporal features characterizing proximate shielding helps explain why they have become permanent fixture within the war on terror. Proximate shields allow warring parties to cast entire civilian populations within cities as human shields, and by so doing, change the proportionality calculations and relax the repertoires of violence permitted to be used in urban settings while laying the blame for crimes against civilians on their enemy. Let's see how this plays out in the Gaza Strip. I should begin by saying that we use Gaza to frame the book. We begin with Rachel Corrie and end the book with a section called Gaza as Prophecy. We included the notion of prophecy because we believe that Gaza is an extreme contemporary manifestation of certain historical processes that reveal how violence, law, and colonial geography are mutually constitutive. In 1948, as a result of ethnic cleansing carried out by Israel, this strip of Mediterranean coast was constituted as a refugee space, a space inhabited primarily by people who were expelled or had fled from their homes during the war. Gaza and Palestine more broadly were reshaped and incorporated into the global order through settler colonial violence, and this turn of events was accepted by the victors of World War II. The Europeans supported Israel's establishment, not least because the fledgling country helped solve the Jewish refugee problem in Europe. Israel, one might say, signified a form of political and legal reparation for crimes perpetrated against Jews on European soil. Tragically, the solution for Europe's Jewish refugees led to the creation of Palestinian refugees. Gaza's Palestinian refugees, alongside the region's original Palestinian inhabitants, have since been fenced in the Strip and denied sovereignty. It is within this context that Rachel Corrie, a 23-year-old student at Evergreen College, traveled from the United States to the Middle East, intending to initiate a sister city project between hometown Olympia and the Palestinian town Rafah in the Gaza Strip. She flew into the area at the very height of the Second Palestinian Uprising, and after a two-day seminar in the offices of the International Solidarity Movement in the West Bank, she continued on to Rafah to join other ISM activists who were trying to prevent Israel's massive demolitions of houses on the Egyptian border. Less than 2 months after her arrival, on March 16, 2003, Corrie was crushed to death as she tried to prevent an Israeli military bulldozer from destroying the home of local pharmacist Samir Nasrallah. Rachel Corrie's horrific death and the acquittal of the soldier who killed her pose a number of questions around human shielding. Why was the killing of a voluntary human shield, an unarmed person who deploys nonviolent forms of protection, deemed legal? What might a history of people in the line of fire teach us about the laws of war and the changing political and social forces that have shaped the global order? And what does Corrie's killing teach us about racial hierarchies in war zones, in war zones and outside them? In the book, we observe that Corrie was well aware of her and I quote, her white skin privilege, as she herself referred to it in her diary. She noted that she was using her white skin to protect non-white civilians and civilian infrastructures. We go on to explain the paradox of voluntary shielding. Insofar as the global public responds favorably to voluntary human shielding, which is informed by racial privilege, it constantly risks reinforcing Western privilege, or in Banu Bargu's words, reinstalling a colonial hierarchy of lives in the very process of challenging that hierarchy. It devalues the work suffering, and death of local non-Western activists, and at times even deflects attention away from the death of populations that Human Shields ultimately seeks to protect. At the same time, it is also true that voluntary shields carry out courageous nonviolent acts, at times risking their own lives to protect the lives of others. Human shielding thus operates simultaneously on two levels. The shield's body, frequently that of a privileged citizen, is subjected to risk as part of a strategy of protection and resistance. Yet the perception of the privileged shield was ostensibly worth more than those he or she is shielding can reinforce existing structures of domination. So we begin the book with Rachel Corrie, and while she was killed in Gaza, it is only later in the book that we actually discuss the Gaza Strip. We show how from 2007, the Gaza Strip was framed by Israel as an enemy entity and was subjected to an ongoing military siege. Lacking any viable political solution, the only way Palestinians can resist the siege while legitimately fighting for self-determination and liberation from colonial domination is by mobilizing civilians and an irregular army. In our work, we analyzed the three Gaza wars, 2008-9, 2012, and 2014, as well as the Great March of Return, which was launched in March 2018. For example, according to data gathered by the United Nations, at least 2,251 Palestinians were killed during the 2014 Operation Protective Edge. Of the verified cases, 1,462 were believed to be civilians. Many of these fatalities involved multiple family members, with at least 142 Palestinian families having 3 or more relatives killed in the same incident, for a total of 739 deaths, which means that their houses were bombed. In addition, approximately 18,000 housing units were either destroyed or severely damaged, leaving approximately 108,000 people homeless. On the Israeli side, 73 people were killed during the war, 67 combatants, and 6 civilians. The discrepancy with respect to the number and proportion of civilian deaths, 65% of all those killed by Israel were civilians, compared to the 8% of civilians killed by Palestinians, created a legal problem, since according to these figures, it appears that in its assault on Gaza, Israel did indeed commit egregious war crimes. It is precisely in this context that one needs to understand Israel's extensive use of the human shielding accusation during and after the 2014 Gaza war. Human shields were mobilized in a semiotic war to defend the lethal violence Israel wielded against Palestinian civilians. One of the first images the IDF circulated during the war sets the stage for the war by portraying Israel's assault as an attempt to defend the very essence of liberalism. It shows rockets with bloody smoke heading towards the Statue of Liberty, one of liberal democracy's icons, and asks the Western public, "What would you do?" In this way, Israel both positioned itself as a liberal democracy and drew an analogy between the Gaza war and America's post-9/11 concerns about terrorist attacks against the United States. The war on Gaza was, according to the infographic, part of the war on terror. Crucially for our analysis, the overwhelming majority of the infographics produced during Protective Edge were dedicated to human shields, and these infographics are circulated both on YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, and Instagram. In many of the infographics, the Israeli military depicts the asymmetric context as symmetric. This is carried out, for instance, through the poster, "Some bomb shelters shelter people, some shelter bombs." Here, the civilian house is portrayed as a shield, and a radically disproportionate situation is presented as if it were balanced. The residents of Gaza are bombed by cutting-edge F-16 fighter jets and drones, yet they do not have bomb shelters and they have nowhere to flee. Israel's residents are bombed mostly by makeshift rockets, many of which are intercepted by Iron Dome missiles. The majority of the population in Israel has access to shelters and can flee out of the rocket's range. The poster, "Where do Gaza's terrorists hide their weapons?" is a paradigmatic example where the subtext does the speaking. Houses, mosques, schools, and hospitals are legitimate targets because they are presumed to serve as shields for weapon depositories. This is also the message in "When is a House a Home?", which simply zooms in on one of the images in the previous poster, showing how Palestinians presumably hide rockets in civilian homes. The logic is straightforward. Insofar as Hamas hides weapons in houses, which is illegitimate, Israel can bomb them as if they were military targets, and that is legitimate. Within this framework, a single function, hiding weapons out of many existing functions, home, shelter, intimacy, etc., determines the status of an urban site, in our case, the house, so that the edifice's form loses its traditional signification. The question, when does it become a legitimate military target, which is on the infographic, is merely a rhetorical one. Its real meaning is all houses in Gaza are legitimate targets, since all houses are potentially non-homes. The infographic suggests that for Palestinians, simply spending time in their homes, frequenting a mosque, going to a hospital or to a school is dangerous, since all these edifices are framed as shields defending legitimate targets and therefore can be bombed. Simultaneously, Israel's legitimization for its indiscriminate bombing is premised on a profound moral disjuncture between Israelis and Palestinians. In the poster, Israel uses weapons to protect its civilians. Hamas uses civilians to protect its weapons. Palestinians are depicted as barbarians who ignore the elementary grammar of international law, the principle of distinction. Palestinian combatants are cast as savages since they weaponize civilians, refusing, as it were, to maintain the moral and legal distinction between civilians and combatants. Indistinction, when carried out by non-state actor, is a key mark of terrorism and barbarism. Concurrently, these images also help transform human beings into collateral damage, subjects who can be killed while the guilt for the death of Palestinian civilians is assigned to Hamas. Israel claims that even though its soldiers may have killed Palestinian civilians, actually Hamas is to blame because it had illegally coerced those who had died, forcing them to serve as human shields. Finally, and why did this turn into this? The military's graphic designer owns up to the, Consider the subtext of the poster featuring Israel's former chief of staff saying, "Even as we carry out strikes, we remember that there are civilians in Gaza. Hamas has turned them into hostages." Again, the logic is clear. All civilians in Gaza are being held hostage by Hamas, which is considered a war crime and a gross violation of international law governing armed conflict. This then provides legal and moral defense against the accusation that Israel's the one killing civilians. Presumed violations carried out by Palestinians against Palestinians, taking hostages and human shielding, thus become the legitimization of lethal and indiscriminate violence on Israel's part. Finally, and why did this turn into this? The military's graphic designer owns up to the consequences of Israel's attack and shows how civilians' homes have been transformed into rubble, but explained that this is what happens when Hamas does not abide by the principle of distinction and uses civilian homes for military purposes. These powerful infographics spread by the Israeli military through social media attempt to transform the very presence of civilians and civilian buildings as suspect in the area it bombards, regardless of the fact that the area it bombs are urban centers. The crux of the matter is that in the context of contemporary asymmetric warfare, the weak do not have many options. In Gaza in particular, fleeing is not an option, while staying put transforms civilians into proximate shields, people who lose some of the protections offered by international law, and if they are killed, then Hamas is to blame. But the shielding accusation was not only deployed during the Gaza wars. In March 2018, the Palestinians launched the March of Return. Each week, thousands of Palestinians would stride towards the fence surrounding this small swath of land in which they have been imprisoned for years as Israeli snipers picked their victims and shot. To some, the Palestinian protests might look suicidal, but to Palestinians, it is the ultimate act of peaceful resistance. Malnutrition, lack of drinking water, daily electricity outages, massive unemployment, and extreme poverty are not abstract slogans for the civilians who have participated in these demonstrations. So week in and week out, they march towards the fence in the hope that the world will hear their anguish and that some country, some leader, or even some movement will support their cause and help them break the siege. But each week, Israel tried hard to push an alternative narrative. The Israeli military disseminated on social media images and videos of young children at protests. One short clip plays the lullaby interrupted by the sound of gunfire and rhetorically asks, "Do you know where your children are?" After showing children amid protesters, it then displays the word "here" in all caps across the screen. Such videos are used as the ultimate proof that Palestinians are deploying children as human shields. Israel justifies the death of civilian protesters by continuously accusing Hamas of using them as human shields, hoping to stir international moral indignation while also trying to muster a legal defense. Morally, the charge is similar to the one we witnessed during the Gaza war and intimates that the Palestinians are savages. Not unlike the imagined barbaric pagans who offered their children to the god, it suggests that the Palestinians of Gaza have no problem sending their sons and daughters to the front line. The subtext is that civilized people protect their children while Palestinians sacrifice them. Legally, since international law defines human shields as protected people or are used to defend legitimate military target, then Israel's claim that Palestinians were using children as human shields during the protests suggests that in Israel's eyes, the protests were made up of children who were transformed into human shields and legitimate military targets. This is precisely the message Dani Danon, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, conveyed in a letter he sent to the Security Council. The terrorists continue to hide behind innocent children to ensure their own survival, he said in reference to the March of Return. Crucially, with this statement, Danon not only shifted the blame, but in effect also categorized anyone who participated in the March of Return as a military target. Indeed, from Israel's perspective, there were no civilians deserving protection in the protests. Every Palestinian in Gaza has been denied citizenship, and all civilians who are active or framed as participating in hostilities, even by taking part in a protest, are denied their civilian status. Israel has placed Palestinians on a humanitarian diet by imposing a military siege, and those who dare protest their subjugation become killable or maimable subjects. As we will see, this killability or maimability is structured by racism. So by way of conclusion, I would like to turn to our claim that Gaza is a prophecy, and to our argument that Israel's relationship to civilians in Gaza portends the relationship of police in liberal democracies to racialized citizens. As I explained, the accusation of human shielding against Palestinians in Gaza is mobilized not only to shift the blame for civilian death from Israel to Hamas, and thus shield Israel from war crime indictments, but that it also helps produce a hierarchy of humanity, namely they use human shields, therefore they are uncivilized, which then frames Palestinians as undeserving of citizenship. Obviously, this is an old colonial trope that had been used time and again to deny citizenship from racialized subjects in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Moreover, Israel's response to the Great March of Return, in which Palestinians demanded the right to return to the lands from which they were expelled in 1948, underscores how the human shielding argument was used to deny Palestinians not only their claim to citizenship, but also their claim to civilianhood and the protections the laws of war afford this status. The denial of citizenship and the denial of civilian protections are thus two co-constituted processes in Gaza. The March of Return and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations are in many ways different, but when we consider the relationship between civilianhood and citizenship, an important similarity emerges. Let's start from a key difference. If the civilian is constituted as passive within the laws of war, the citizen, by contrast, is conceptualized in democratic political thought as someone who is encouraged to actively participate in political processes. In this sense, the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States are conceptually and practically very different from the stateless and therefore citizenless protesters in Gaza. The first are formally entitled to actively participate in protests, while the second are prohibited. But the proliferation of human shields in Black Lives Matter protests suggests that the protesters in both settings share a crucial similarity. Police officers kill Black citizens, And then police forces with warlike equipment are sent to subdue Black Lives Matter anti-racist protesters who demand justice and equal citizenship. The violence exerted by the police against these demonstrators has propelled mainly white protesters to create human walls of voluntary human shields in order to protect their racialized allies. As mentioned, the relation between the white human shields and the Black protesters both exposes the racial hierarchy informing society. Only white people can serve as shields because their lives are considered more valuable in the police's eyes, and paradoxically reasserts the racial hierarchy informing society because acting as human shields reaffirms white privilege. Yet what we have been witnessing in the United States and elsewhere is that Blacks are afforded a racialized notion of citizenship that is quite similar to the way civilians are imagined in the laws of war and treated in Gaza. Formally, Black citizens are entitled to protest as active citizens. But in practice, they're too often treated like civilians, which according to the laws of war are entitled to protection only if they remain passive. This helps explain why in the United States and elsewhere, political struggles waged by Black citizens are frequently imagined as hostile, particularly when directed against state abuses, and violence is routinely deployed to repress them. By contrast, political struggles waged by whites tend to be imagined as benign and are dealt with in a very different manner. All of which suggests that the state and its law enforcement organs construe passivity and activity through a racialized lens. If, in other words, Black Lives Matter protesters reject the passive citizenship to which the state confines them, they are recognized and treated as hostiles, not unlike the way militaries treat non-white civilians who become active in war zones. In this sense, Black citizenship morphs into passive civilians as imagined by the laws of war. Black citizens are not only deterred from actively taking part in political struggles within the public arena, but passivity is the condition for receiving protections in the face of state violence. It is in this sense that Gaza is a prophecy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Neve. That was a really interesting conversation there. I'm really interested to see what people in the audience would like to ask you in terms of questions. I'll start off by, I was really drawn to your final sentence in the book, which you finish up your discussion with here, which is the almost complete erosion of the civilian in Gaza is an omen, a sign of the increasing precarity of citizenship and the protections that it promises. So I have two questions, one that's related to a kind of more broad theme about human shielding, and the second related specifically to Gaza and Israel-Palestine in general. The first you've kind of intimated in your discussion of Black Lives Matter, where you've talked about the kind of racialization of human shields and, you know, the idea that some people's lives matter more than others, this kind of racialized citizenship that we see. But I'm just wondering if human shield, in the book you talk about the fact that human shields are simultaneously both protected and not protected in this kind of state of liminality. So where do you see, and you do intimate in some of the books, I just want to tease out, where you see some of the examples where human shields are more protected than others. So that's the first question, it's a more general one. And the second one is related to Palestine and Gaza. Do you use the phrase that Israel is using the idea of human shields as a kind of way of humanizing war crimes. Given that phrase, and given what you've outlined here today, what do you think about, and given you're a professor of international law, of course, what do you think about the recent announcement a few months ago by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that they will be able to investigate war crimes in the occupied Palestinian territory? What do you think that Israel's strategy will be there? What do you think the Palestinians will be, and what do you think the ICC will do? I know that these are big questions, but I thought I would kick off with the big ones. Thank you. Please, others, could you put in your questions to the chat box too?
Great, thanks for these questions, Mandy. They're terrific. So what we see in the Middle East and in war zones is a bit different than what we see in protests. In war zones, we rarely see what we used in the argument about human shields is basically that related to the development of the laws of war and the extension of civilian status to the ex-colonized. So before decolonization, the laws of war were not applicable to colonial wars. And what we saw happening is that after World War II, we have I would say, a certain kind of progressive move within the laws of war, where more protections were offered to civilians, and these protections over time were also extended to the civilian populations in the ex-colonial countries. What we see happening since then, and particularly after the war on terror was launched, that high-tech militaries, particularly the United States, Israel, but also other countries, are waging a war against terror, mainly in the Middle East, but also in Africa. And during this war on terror, they're killing a lot of civilians. Now, it's illegal to kill civilians according to international law because the civilian population is protected. And what we saw over time is the kind of proliferation of accusation by these high-tech states that these are not civilians, but rather they are human shields. And suddenly whole civilian populations are framed as if they are human shields. Now, by framing them, by casting them as human shields, the high-tech states accomplish two or three things, some of which I mentioned. One is that they revert the blame of the death of these human shields to their enemies because it's not allowed to use people as human shields. Two, they blame their enemy for being uncivilized because they do not know how to maintain a distinction between civilian and combatant and transform basically civilians into weapons. And three, it enables them to relax the repertoires of violence that they deployed. Because if the Gaza Strip is not an area full of protected civilian edifices and people, but actually full of mosques that are shielding and schools that are shielding and houses that are shielding and hospitals that are shielding and populations that are all shields, then I can use repertoires of violence that are more lethal in bombing the city than I could if the city was full of civilians. So it allows the attacking party to change a bit its repertoires of violence. But what we also see is that this human shielding accusation is really directed towards people of color, and we saw that really clearly in when the war in Yemen began. So when the war in Yemen began, there was a lot of accusations of the use of human shielding. There still are, but I'm looking at the first few months. And I'm looking at the time when there were 10,000 civilian deaths in Ukraine. At the same, or 10,000 deaths in total. At the same time, there were 10,000 deaths in Yemen. There was 10,000 deaths in Ukraine. There were no mention of human shields in Ukraine because that's between white populations. The human shielding enters as a kind of defense mechanism by state militaries when they are fighting against people of color, and is used in that way to basically legitimize the killing of civilians of color. Regarding the ICC investigation, I mean, I don't have much hope with these investigation, and I'm not a great believer of the law and the legal strategy, particularly in the international arena. I'm much more a believer of grassroots social movements bringing about social change. So it is not my kind of preferred strategy of resistance in any way. It can be used as a tool of reputation and as a tool of basically the very idea that it is investigating Israel for war crimes raises the issue of war crimes, and in that sense, it's important. Whether I have any belief that something will come out of it, I don't think something will come out of it. I wouldn't put much belief in it. It's part of a process that is taking force, and I think I'm not going to comment on. I mean, I've written a bit about it, but it's not really related to human shield, so I'm going to kind of leave it there.
That's okay. I've got a few questions that I'm going to ask you now, but I just thought I'd give a shout out to the institution that you co-help with at the Queen Mary, which is the International State Crimes Initiative, which is a fabulous initiative, I think, that focuses on the crimes by states. I think it's one of the few in the world that actually does that. So just to give a shout out to your institute. We have a question here from the HCRI director, Bertrand Tate, who says, "Thank you, Neve. I have looked at volunteer human shields during the Vietnam War, and specifically the British Quakers and pacifists. At the same time, the late 60s, civil rights human shields also existed. So in a sense, is the prophecy not a return to old ways?" And then he adds, in particular, some of the ways of decolonization wars, in particular the war in Gaza. He remembers an interview with Ariel Sharon, which made a direct parallel with the Battle of Algiers.
A few things. Yeah, what I mean, we're writing a history of human shields, so clearly we agree that this is not a new phenomenon, and we deal with Vietnam, not with the voluntary human shields in Vietnam, but we deal with the accusation that the American accusation that a people's war is a shielding war and therefore is illegitimate. And I won't get into that here. But actually, I spent quite a lot of time looking for the use of human shields in the civil rights movement in the United States and in civil rights protests. And I also consulted with several experts that spent their life researching the civil rights movement, and we couldn't find a case of shielding them in the protest. And it's interesting why, and I'm not going to get into it now, but in that sense, there is a kind of a change there. So what I think is happening is that what we do see is we see a few things that are different. We definitely see a proliferation of the shielding accusation. I mean, human shield has become it's become part of common language. Actually, when we thought of writing the book, as an anecdote, when we thought of beginning to write the book, we did a Google Scholar, a Google alert for human shields, that anytime human shields appears in the newspaper, we'll get an email at the end of the day of all the newspaper articles where it appeared, which is a very good way of, kind of beginning to do research. And what we saw is the proliferation of articles dealing with human shields over the years that we were doing this research. So it's clear. And then we did actually a sustained search in newspapers, and there is this proliferation. So one of the differences, I think, in the context of protests, which is very important, is the militarization of the police in the United States and elsewhere. And so what we see today is police departments with Humvees, police departments with basically full military garb, helicopters in the air, and using strategies that are very similar to the strategies, let's say, Israel uses in the West Bank. And that kind of dialectical or action and reaction, and the human shields suddenly become so. I think there was an exponential growth of human shielding in the United States since George Floyd was murdered and since the Black Lives Matter protest. And that is a different phenomena. And it does point to both the fact that the US is a white supremacist society, because it does underscore the racial hierarchies in society, the fact that you need a white human shield to protect you. And in that sense, I agree with you that there isn't a difference. The US was a white supremacist society also in the 1960s. It is that the mechanism of violence have changed, and the mechanisms of defense are changing too, to this kind of I think that was the issue. And we also see in the war zones, we see who gets to be a human shield and who doesn't. The history of human shielding is also the history of the human, or the borders of who is considered a human, not in the biological sense of human, but in the political sense. And so we see that if in the wars we look at in the beginning of the book, like the American Civil War, the Franco-German War, and so forth, it was mostly white men that could serve as human shields. Women and children could not serve as human shields, and so forth. Today, almost solely, the human shielding population in the Middle East are women and children. And we explain that in the book, why that is the case and so forth. So I hope that kind of answers.
It kind of neatly comes on to a series of questions that I'm going to cluster together. One of them is, given that white people becoming voluntary shields for non-white allies reaffirms privilege, is there a better way for white allies to work with their non-white counterparts? Should this practice not be utilised? And added on to that, another question from another participant, is the practice of white people serving as human shields for people of colour an example of white saviour complex?
These are excellent questions, and I don't think there's easy answers to them. The way I think about it is that what we need first and foremost to center stage is solidarity. And solidarity, and also in situations like this, allow the voices of the racialized group to lead, to take the lead. If they don't want human shields, then you shouldn't serve as a human shield. That is clear to me. Now, it's a paradox because it does reinforce and reify certain social hierarchies, but at the same time, it is also a very courageous act. I mean, Rachel Corrie was courageous. I think the moms in Portland were courageous, and a lot of white protesters throughout, in the face of the immense violence used against these Black protesters, put their bodies on the line. But it has to be done first with a lot of self-reflection. You have to be aware of what you're doing and not become the savior, as one of the questioners said. And you also have to revert to the Black protesters. And we describe in the book cases, I think one was in Toronto, where the Black protesters came to the whites and said, listen, you're taking the center stage, move back. Okay, we don't want you as human shields here. And that's very important too. And yet, at the same time, it is a great act of solidarity and can be a great act of solidarity between the two groups, of one standing next to the other and willing to take the violence that is directed at the other. So I think it's something that we constantly need to work and rework and rethink and rework through conversation, through self-reflection, and through openness. But I would not like to give it up as a political strategy. I think it's actually can be a very good political strategy if it is done through constant conversation and self-reflection, and referring back to the people of color.
Thank you. I have another question which relates to the US civil rights movement and your comments earlier that you couldn't find any human shields in that example. And one of our participants has asked, you wouldn't consider people like Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner in the US civil rights movements to have been human shields?
So I looked closely, for example, on the free, how is it called? The free, on the free riders. Do you remember, Mandy? What happens there, I couldn't understand it, but I think the whites that identified with the Blacks and that participated in the struggle of the Blacks were often hated more than the Blacks themselves, and therefore they couldn't serve as human shields. Because one of the acts of using human shield is that you use your privilege as a deterrence, and the whites there could not deter. The hatred towards the white was so great that their body could not serve as a deterrence to protect the people behind them. And so I would say no. I think that the hatred was greater often towards the whites, and that they lost their privilege, their racialized privilege, when they identified with the civil rights movement. And so in a sense, we see a change, a bit of a change in the way that the white supremacist society operates, and that there has been a movement in the United States. I don't know if to call it for the good, but whites now do carry whites that identify with Blacks do carry a certain kind of privilege that they didn't in the 1960s.
It's really interesting what you were saying, and I'm just going to use chair's privilege here to ask you. It kind of relates in some ways, the idea, as you kind of outlined in the United States example, that the white people who were standing up for Black rights, I just wondered if there was a kind of parallel with what we're seeing in Israel at the moment, because, you know, I 10 years ago did some research and clearly, you know quite a few anti-Zionist Jewish Israeli activists, and they themselves have witnessed a change in the last 10 years, where their privilege as Jewish Israelis might be coming to an end. And I wondered if you had any observations on what that told us about Israeli society and kind of the ways in which, the kind of racialized way in which you're characterizing human shields.
So I agree with your observation. I think that is definitely happening. Certain privileges that I had as a white Ashkenazi Jew in Israel are I don't have them anymore. I'm still very privileged, but you know, you can go to a protest and you can easily be the subject of violence, even though you're white. So I think Israel is definitely going in that direction, that people with that identify with the Palestinian liberation, or Jews that identify with the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination, that once still maintained their privilege and still were considered legitimate within the settler colonial society, are rapidly losing their legitimacy. Yes, I absolutely think that is the case. And in that sense, it's becoming closer to what I found to be the case in the 1960s in the United States, in the relation to those that identified with the civil rights movement. So the answer is yes, absolutely. I think but it's a reversed kind of inversed relationship with the United States.
We have another question that comes back to the issue of the civil rights movement in the United States. And one of the questions is kind of referring to the issue of Quakers, for example, and saying the intersection between Martin Luther King Jr. and the Quakers and Howard R. Macy. And the question is, what about, in relation to that, what about the religious dimension of shielding? Was this something that you and Nicola considered when you were undertaking your research?
So a lot of the voluntary shielding comes from religious groups, particularly the Quakers. So absolutely, we saw that. It's very clear to me that that is the case. This kind of liberation theology groups. It's very clear to me that that is the case. We didn't actually dive into it seriously and do considerable research, but I would like to mention one case which we have a chapter dedicated in the book about, and that's about Maud Royden. Now, I didn't know who Maud Royden was when I came across her name, and I don't know how many people here know who Maud Royden was, but Maud Royden was a superstar. Maud Royden was I think the first woman preacher in the United Kingdom here in London. And I think her church was called the Guildford Church, if I remember correctly. And she was major. I mean, so she was a feminist. She was a pacifist, anti-war activist, and she toured the United States, for example, several times. And when she would come to speak in the United States, we're talking about audiences of 5,000 people. So it's not like a minor person coming to speak. And she decided when Japan invaded China in 1932, she decided to create an army of voluntary shields and to go to Shanghai to stop the warring parties from fighting. And we describe her effort to do this, and we describe the whole rationale of an army of peace, as she calls it, and how voluntary shields can be used as an army of peace, and so forth in the book. And it is clear that it is informed her whole the whole way she looks at the situation and analyzes it is informed by her religious and humanist background, and so forth. And then when we began doing research about her and went into into her diaries and into the different texts that she wrote and so forth, you can see through correspondence that it's other religious leaders, and then it comes up again and again. So there was the Human Shields Action Group that went to the first Iraq War that was made up of a lot of religious people. A lot of religious people try to go into Gaza, and so there is part, and it's part of the humanist tradition. It's clear to me that that is it, and the beautiful part of it, because the humanist tradition also has a side to it that is very violent at the same time. So it is one pole of the humanist tradition, and it comes through a certain reading and liberation reading of the religious texts. Yes.
Yeah, just to come back with you on that, when I was living in Jerusalem, I met lots of people who were in religious groups, including the Quakers, but also the more established churches, who were frequently acting as human shields, if you like, going on the anti-wall demonstrations, going and living with Bedouin communities that were under threat of of bulldozing, etc. So it was very interesting to see that aspect of that kind of liberation theology, as you say. Where do you think that your research is going to go now, Neve? Are you going to continue with the human shielding aspects? I think what was fascinating about this book and the last book you did with Nicola was how you used examples to tease out very big questions related to international law and responsibility to civilians. And while we don't expect you to tell us your secrets of your next research project, I just wondered if you could maybe give us an idea of where you think you're going with this big general project about looking at international law, the rights of civilians through these paradigms.
I'm at a crossroads. To be frank, if we're kind of very honest, I just got a large grant rejected. And so I'm in a crossroads between two ideas for projects. And one deals with killer robots and the whole idea of machine learning robots and AI, and artificial intelligence, in the killing process, and the inability of the laws of war to address that. And the other deals with what a lot of people in your center or institute are doing, and that has to do with the relationship between war and health, and the similarity in the logics between war and health. The idea that war is about saving and that health is about saving, and at the same time how the medical professionals are being strategically targeted in war zone. You have Larissa Fast that wrote an amazing book on aid workers, and so I'm at a crossroad where I still don't know where I'm going, but that's what makes academic life so fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I just had a last minute question from someone saying, thank you for a very interesting talk. Although the principle of distinction is particularly aligned with the laws of war, is this applied to civil protests? If not, do you think international humanitarian law could incorporate this in the future to prevent collateral damage outside of typical conflict contexts?
No, the laws of war apply only in international humanitarian law, and the laws of war is the same name, is a different name for the same body of law. And the laws of war, international humanitarian law, which are informed by the principle of distinction, do not apply in non-armed in situations of non-armed conflict. And during that situation, it is human rights law that is applicable. And the main there are many differences between them, but one of the main differences is that the laws of war, according to the laws of war or international humanitarian law, it is permissible to kill. Human rights law does not allow to kill. And when it becomes permissible to kill, that is when the notion of distinction is very important, because it distinguishes between who it is permissible to kill and who is protected. And that's why that principle is, I argue, the bedrock of international humanitarian law. In civil protests, you're not allowed to kill and you're not allowed to use civil violence to subdue the protesters. And that's what we are seeing today, not because I think the relation to the Blacks has become worse necessarily than it was in the 60s. I didn't want to suggest that, but because the tools and the instruments at the disposal of the police officers are worse. And so what you have is you have these robocops basically trained in full combat gear, and then they're going to be much more lethal and not protect the rights of the civil protest. And that's when the white activists can use maybe their privilege to protect themselves. But we did see, for example, which again relates to the civil rights movement, we did see how in Portland, for example, large groups of whites stood in front to protect Black protesters, and then the whites were attacked also. So it's not clear how effective human shielding is as a strategy of resistance, but it can be very effective as an act of solidarity.
And I think on that note, as an act of solidarity, to your great answers to lots of very interesting questions. Thank you, Neve, for presenting your book here today and sharing your thoughts with us about international law and the laws of war, which I think these are huge debates that will continue. I'm sorry to hear about your grant failure. I also myself have had my own grant failures recently, so we are both in solidarity on that.
Now, I just want to say that I like to also talk about rejections, because we don't do it enough in academia. And it's very important that people realize that all of us are constantly rejected, and it's fine, and we just have to move on.
Thank you for that. So even the great Neve Gordon gets rejected for grant applications sometimes.
All the time, all the time.
Well, thank you, Neve, for coming here today. I look forward to engaging with you in the future, and specifically on what project you're going to do next. I'm sure my colleague Larissa will be interested to see whether you develop some ideas around war and health. Her own big project at the moment is coming to fruition over the next year or so. And I'm sure she'll be presenting her work very soon, and we would like to invite you to that. So thank you again for today. Thank you to HCRI for organising this part of the series, and see you soon.
Thank you.